In the small coastal town of Havenport, where the sea whispered secrets to the cliffs and the lighthouse stood as a silent sentinel, lived an old man named Elias. His home was a modest cottage at the edge of town, its paint chipped by years of salt and wind, but its windows glowed warmly each evening as if defying the encroaching dusk. Elias was known to everyone, yet known by few. He was the lantern keeper, not of the lighthouse which had been automated decades ago, but of something less tangible, something the townsfolk couldn't quite name but felt in their bones when they passed his cottage. He was a man who carried light, not in his hands but in his quiet, steady presence. Elias was in his late 70s with a face etched like driftwood, each line telling a story of storms weathered and joys savored. His eyes, a pale blue that mirrored the sea on a clear day, held a spark that hadn't dimmed despite the years. He walked with a slight limp, a remnant of a fall from a fishing boat in his youth, and carried a worn leather satchel that seemed to hold more than its size suggested. Every morning, he'd shuffle through Havenport's cobblestone streets, nodding to shopkeepers, tossing crumbs to the gulls, and pausing to listen to anyone who needed an ear. The townsfolk called him the Listener, a title he neither confirmed nor denied, but one that fit him like his faded wool coat. On the outskirts of Havenport, near the old pier where the waves chewed at rotting wood, lived Mara, a young woman, who seemed to carry the weight of the world in her slumped shoulders. At 26, Mara was a stranger to most, having arrived in town a year ago with little more than a backpack and a guarded expression. She worked odd jobs, cleaning houses, mending nets, or stacking crates at the fish market, but never stayed long enough to befriend anyone. Her hair, dark and tangled, often fell across her face, as if she preferred to hide from the world. Rumors swirled about her. She was running from something or someone, though no one dared ask. Mara rented a tiny room above the bait shop, its walls thin enough to let in the cold and the cries of the gulls. She kept to herself, her life a quiet rhythm of work and solitude, her eyes always scanning the horizon as if waiting for something to appear or to vanish. One chilly November morning, as fog draped Havenport like a widow's veil, Elias noticed Mara sitting on the pier, her knees drawn to her chest. She was staring at the gray waves, her hands wrapped around a cracked mug that held nothing but the memory of coffee. Elias had seen her there before, always alone, always with that same faraway look. Today, though, something stirred in him. A nudge, like the tide pulling at the shore. He approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel, and sat beside her on the damp bench without asking permission. Mara stiffened but didn't move away. For a long while, neither spoke. The sea roared softly, and the gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the fog. "You ever wonder what the ocean's trying to say?" Elias finally asked, his voice low, like he was confiding a secret. Mara glanced at him, her brow furrowing, but she didn't answer. Elias didn't push. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small battered tin. Inside were homemade biscuits, slightly misshapen but fragrant with butter and herbs. He offered one to her. "Made these last night. They're better warm, but they'll do." Mara hesitated, her fingers twitching as if unsure whether to trust the gesture. Hunger won out, and she took a biscuit, nibbling at its edge. "Why do you do that?" she asked after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do what?" Elias said, though his eyes twinkled like he knew exactly what she meant. "Be nice. To everyone. Even me." Her tone wasn't accusing but curious, as if kindness were a puzzle she couldn't solve. Elias chuckled, a sound like pebbles rolling in the surf. Suppose it's habit. World's heavy enough without me adding to it. He paused, looking out at the sea. Besides, everyone's carrying something. Doesn't hurt to offer a little light. Mara didn't respond, but she took another bite of the biscuit, her shoulders easing slightly. Elias didn't press her for more. He simply sat, sharing the silence, until the fog began to lift, and the first rays of sun pierced the gray. When he stood to leave, he placed another biscuit on the bench beside her. "For later," he said, and walked away, his limp more pronounced in the cold. That small encounter marked the beginning of something neither could have predicted. Over the next few weeks, Elias made a point of crossing paths with Mara. He'd find her at the pier or outside the fish market or trudging home from a long day's work. Each time he offered something small, a biscuit, a knitted scarf he claimed he'd found in his cottage, a thermos of hot soup on a particularly bitter day. Mara accepted these gifts warily, like a stray cat unsure whether to trust a hand extended with food. But she began to talk, at first in short bursts, then in longer threads. She spoke of the sea, of the way it seemed to hold answers she couldn't quite hear. She never spoke of her past, and Elias never asked. He listened, his presence a steady anchor in her stormy world. One evening, as winter tightened its grip on Havenport, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. The wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and tearing shingles from roofs. Elias, who'd seen many storms in his time, knew this one was different. It carried a weight, a warning. He thought of Mara, alone in her thin-walled room, above the bait shop, and his heart tugged. He pulled on his coat, grabbed his satchel, and headed into the gale. The streets were empty, the town hunkered down against the storm's fury. When Elias reached the bait shop, he found the door to Mara's room ajar, swinging wildly in the wind. Inside the room was a mess, papers scattered, a single chair overturned, and no sign of Mara. Panic gripped him, but he forced it down, his mind racing. The pier. She'd be at the pier. He found her there, standing at the edge, her thin jacket no match for the rain that lashed her face. She was gripping the railing, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the churning sea. Elias called her name, but the wind stole his voice. He limped forward, his bad leg protesting, and grabbed her arm. She flinched but didn't pull away. "Mara, come on," he shouted over the storm. "You'll freeze out here." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "I can't keep running, Elias. I can't." The words spilled out, raw and jagged, like glass breaking. Elias didn't know what she was running from, but he saw the weight of it in her eyes. Grief, fear, a past that clung like damp seaweed. He tightened his grip on her arm, gentle but firm. "You don't have to run, but you don't have to face it alone either." He pulled her away from the edge, guiding her toward the shelter of an old boathouse nearby. Inside, the air was damp but still, the storm's roar muffled by the sturdy walls. Elias rummaged in his satchel and pulled out a blanket, draping it over Mara's shoulders. She sank to the floor, her breath hitching, and for the first time, she let herself cry. Elias sat beside her, saying nothing, his presence a quiet promise. When her sobs slowed, she began to speak. She told him of a life left behind, a family fractured by loss, a mistake that haunted her, a guilt that had driven her to Havenport in search of a fresh start. She thought solitude was her punishment, her only path. Elias listened, his heart aching for the young woman who'd carried so much alone. "You're not your mistakes," he said when she finished, his voice steady as the lighthouse beam. You're what you do with them. And you're here, Mara. That's a start. She looked at him, her eyes red but searching. Why do you care? I'm nobody to you. Elias smiled, a soft, weathered thing. Nobody's nobody, and you remind me of someone I used to know. He didn't elaborate, and Mara didn't ask. But in that moment, a thread of trust wove itself between them, fragile but real. The storm passed, leaving Havenport battered but standing. In the weeks that followed, Mara began to change. It was slow, like the tide carving new paths in the sand. She started joining Elias on his morning walks, helping him scatter crumbs for the gulls or carry groceries for the elderly widow down the street. She laughed sometimes, a sound that startled her as much as it warmed Elias. The townsfolk noticed too. They began to greet her by name, to offer her small kindnesses, a free coffee at the diner, a warm scarf from the knitting circle. Mara, who'd once kept the world at arm's length, began to let it in. One spring morning, as the cliffs bloomed with wildflowers and the sea sparkled under a hopeful sun, Elias fell ill. It was sudden, a fever that gripped him and wouldn't let go. The town rallied, bringing soup and blankets to his cottage, but Elias waved them off with a weak smile. "I'm just resting," he'd say, though his cough told a different story. Mara, who'd grown to see Elias as a father she'd never had, refused to leave his side. She cleaned his cottage, brewed tea, and read to him from his favorite book of poetry, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias took her hand. "You've got light in you, Mara," he said, his voice faint but clear. "Don't let it go out." She nodded, tears spilling, and promised she wouldn't. Elias passed quietly that night, his cottage glowing with the warmth of a single lantern. Havenport mourned, but Mara felt his loss like a hole in her chest. Yet, in her grief, she found purpose. She took up Elias's satchel, filling it with biscuits, scarves, and small tokens of kindness. She walked his routes, listened to the townsfolk, and shared his light. The pier, once her place of solitude, became a place of connection, where she'd sit with others, offering a biscuit or a kind word. Years later, Havenport still spoke of Elias, the lantern keeper, but they spoke of Mara too. She'd become their listener, their light bearer, a woman who'd turned her pain into purpose. The cottage by the cliffs glowed each evening, its windows a beacon for anyone who needed it. And Mara, no longer running, stood at the heart of it all, her life a testament to the truth Elias had shown her, that kindness given freely could light even the darkest corners of the world.